Tobias, senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Murdoch University, Perth, and a specially appointed professor at Hiroshima University. He holds PhDs in political science and earth science, so double PhD, very impressive. And he's worked intensively on the intersections of climate change, the environment, peace, and conflict. He's published over 60 journal articles since 2014, including in International Security. That's the piece that many of us read today, that I circulated to everybody in the Zoom chat window. The Journal of Peace Research and Nature Climate Change. In 2023, he received the International Studies Association Emerging Peace Studies Scholar Award and the International Science Prize for Peace and Ecology in the Anthropocene.
So the starting point of the research I'm presenting is, where's my mouse? There's my mouse. Is basically twofold starting point. So the first one is that we see, as you see on the top graph here, that there's an increase in disaster risks, disaster intensity and disaster frequency around the world. We see more events, we see more economic losses, not so much more mortality, but definitely more events and losses. And that's because of, climate change, of ongoing poverty, of urbanization, and so on. And then on the other hand, we see a large number of armed conflicts, mostly within states. And even if you compare it to the period after World War II, we see there has only been 1 year with more than 50 armed conflicts worldwide until 2014, which was 1991. But then since 2014, every single year had more than 50 armed conflicts ongoing worldwide. So with more disasters and more conflicts, obviously we will see more disasters striking conflict zones. And it also feeds into larger debates about climate change and security. But we have actually very little knowledge about what happens when disasters strike conflict zones. And that's where the project starts. And the project has this theoretical framework, which I will skip because it takes a while to explain, and I can weave it into the results. So briefly speaking, I know you know a lot of the method if you read the international security paper. In short, what I did is I analyzed 36 cases. So this one includes the earthquakes and the tsunamis, which are not part of the international security paper because it's climate-related disasters only. But this one also includes earthquakes and all other kinds of events around the world. Collected in-depth qualitative information, but also quantitative data on a number of indicators to really deep dive into what happens when disasters strike conflict zones. Do conflicts tend to escalate? So we see more fighting, more battle-related deaths. Do they de-escalate, or does nothing happen? All right, in the full sample, so we jump right into the results. And the sample covers like basically all cases with more than 1,000 disasters producing more than 1,000 fatalities striking an armed conflict zone. So it was no intentional sampling. It's pure coincidence that it looks so symmetric, but it's obviously not unwelcome. So we see in about half of the cases, disasters have no impact on conflict dynamics. And this is either because the disaster happened far away from the conflict or it didn't affect the conflict parties. In 1/4 of the cases, we see an escalation of the fighting, which basically, I mean, that's 1/4 of a case, so it's quite significant. So we see that in a warming world with more disasters, actually, yes, the concerns about more intense conflicts are well justified. But then, and it's something that we do not often discuss actually, in another 1/4 of the cases, we see actually conflicts de-escalate significantly. Conflict really going down by, I mean, often more than 5 standard deviations in terms of battle-related deaths, much less fighting in the year after a disaster. And that's something that we do not often discuss. And obviously, it provides a window of opportunity in terms of if you want to restart diplomatic negotiations or if you want to deliver aid, both disaster-related and conflict-related, which is much more safe to do if fighting is on a lower intensity. And then in the theoretical framework, which I skipped, I identified 6 potential pathways that could explain the different patterns, 3 for escalation, 3 for de-escalation. And the first one, motivate, is more like how do disasters shape the sentiments or the motives of the individual people? So do they increase grievances and feelings of injustices because of the disaster? Or do they lead to more local level cooperation, solidarity? And we see that this one has further low explanatory power. And this is not because we don't see grievances, we don't see solidarity after disasters. It's mostly because these grievances articulate in local protests, and the solidarity articulates in local level cooperation, but it rarely scales up to a level that we would see at, nationwide or at least region-wide fighting dynamics. The most significant driver of both escalation or de-escalation is the strategic environment. So disasters open up opportunities for rebel groups, most often, basically for both conflict parties, government troops and rebel parties, but it's more frequent for rebel groups. And they open up opportunities because they can recruit disaster-deprived survivors for their cause. They can make inroads into communities by providing disaster relief because the government is weakened after a disaster. But on the other hand, disasters also pose significant constraints to conflict parties. Among others, because troop mobility is reduced, it's harder to raise funding. Both the government and the rebels are often expected to, provide disaster-related aid to their constituency, so that's manpower and resources that are missing elsewhere. What I want to highlight here is that if you see right on the bottom, you have the image cultivation pathway. So that pathway basically assumes that there are situations after disasters where conflict parties might have the motives to escalate fighting, might even have the opportunities to escalate fighting, but they won't do so because they want to convey a message to third actors. Usually disasters draw a lot of attention from both international and domestic audiences. And it's usually not, or it's often not very well received that conflict parties, rather than, making space for humanitarian aid, helping with the disaster, that they intensify the fighting. That's usually not well received, both among international supporters and local level supporters. So we see cases where the conflict parties de-escalate the fighting to portray a positive image, to show themselves as the responsible, the rulers, the good guys, the ones who care about the population. And that is especially frequent after large-scale disasters, because large-scale disasters obviously draw a lot of attention. Talking about the opportunities, I think I already mentioned, so I will skip that as well. And this is basically the same graph you saw before, just in a more arrowy way. And it basically asks, why do we see some of these pathways happening? Because, I mean, that's what we're eventually interested in, like in terms of predicting and being able to provide advice to decision makers. And what I found is basically that disasters have an impact on conflict dynamics if societies have a high vulnerability to disasters. That is, they're dependent on agriculture, they have high poverty levels, they have bad early warning systems, and so on. And if the disaster has an effect, a significant effect, usually negative, on at least one conflict party. And because otherwise the conflict parties wouldn't change their calculations. So only in these cases we see disasters having an impact on conflict dynamics. But why do we see sometimes an escalation and sometimes a de-escalation? Well, we see a de-escalation if the disaster benefits one conflict party relative to the other. So if it changes the relative power dynamics, if the rebels can recruit, but the government is negatively affected, or as in the case of Boko Haram in Nigeria in 2022, if the rebel camps in the forest areas are flooded, and then the government can move in to attack the area because the rebels have lost their hideouts. So it's essentially about this short-term change in power dynamics. On the other hand, we see a de-escalation of fighting if one conflict party is weakened by a disaster, and the other party is unable to exploit that weakness, either because it's weakened by the disaster itself, it got its fighters killed, its fighters wounded, its infrastructure destroyed, its income sources devastated, and so on, or because the rebels are small and insignificant anyway, or the government has a low presence in the area. The interesting thing about that is when I talk to people on the ground who work on conflict dynamics in UN missions, in embassies and so on, that quite often, if you're really an expert on the local conflict, if there's a major disaster happening, usually within 2 to 3 weeks, you get a pretty good idea of how it affects the government, how it affects the rebel groups. So basically what I'm telling them is, look, if you feel it's changing the power dynamics in favor of one side, prepare for escalation. And that obviously means if you deliver aid, if you have boots on the ground or aid on the ground, you need to be much more careful. But if it weakens both conflict parties or the stronger of the two, probably restart diplomatic initiatives and prepare for de-escalation that could see enhanced windows of opportunity for aid delivery. So we really feel this could make a difference, hopefully at least. The first example is the 2004 tsunami in Sri Lanka. That was a massive tsunami, killed over 35,000 people and devastated large areas of especially northern and eastern Sri Lanka. At a time when the country was in an intense civil war between the government on the one side and the Tamil Tiger rebel groups that were fighting for an independent Tamil state in the north and east, which also controlled large swaths of coastal land in the north and the east at that time. We saw a peace process starting around the year 2001, but being basically stuck around 2004, which both sides basically being unable to agree on a lot of things. And then we had a major tsunami happening. And after the tsunami, we see a rapid rise in armed conflict intensity within the first 9 or 10 months, really massive increase in battle intensity. And this has several reasons. One of them, but at least 2 of them relate to the tsunami. So the first one is there was a massive fallout about the aid delivery between the rebels and the government. The rebels wanted to deliver the aid themselves. So with all the international goods flowing in, they wanted to deliver them in the areas they controlled. With the state obviously being not happy with that, because which government would allow the rebel groups, to deliver aid and win hearts and minds? So they wanted to deliver the aid, but the rebels were afraid that the government would reap the benefits of helping the local people and would also use it to spy on them. So they insisted on basically delivering the aid, with one of the consequences being that very little aid initially reached the areas in the north and the east that was controlled by the rebels, which in turn fueled narratives there about the government not being concerned about them, not helping them, sabotaging them, which, I mean, in turn deepened the political fault lines underlying the conflict. The other thing is a bit of, and I mean, here it says that power is not always just this objective thing, that perceptions of power changes played a role on both sides, because both sides were somewhat weakened by the disaster, but in both cases, each conflict party was conceived that it was better off after the tsunami. So the government counted on the rebels being significantly weakened because the tsunami was so massive in the rebel-controlled areas, and the rebels being convinced that the government was weakened because it had a lot of bases along the coast and it had to provide a lot of disaster relief, lax tax income, and so on. So both parties calculated that this was a good time to launch some offensives to continue to intensify the fighting. The other side would be weakened, so they could make some territorial gains and put on the pressure on the other side in the negotiations, because you're in a better negotiation position if you're making military gains. But if both parties are convinced they can do that and scale up the fighting, plus we see deeper political cleavages, we see an escalation of the fighting. That's what happened. The other case would be the flooding, the 2010 flooding in Pakistan that was striking Pakistan at a time when it was in an intense military conflict with the TTP. the Pakistani Taliban in the northern areas of the country. Then we have these massive floods, billions of economic damage, which is quite significant in an economy like Pakistan, and up to 20% of the country's territory being underwater. And there were a lot of concerns that the Taliban would actually use that for their favor, and to extend the fighting, but they actually couldn't do that. And they couldn't do that for two reasons. The first one is that in northern Pakistan, where the state usually or traditionally has a very, very low presence, the Taliban are, after all kind of disasters, the first responders to disasters. They have been for earthquakes in the past, they have been for floods in the past. That's how they, keep a bond with the local population. I mean, they also keep it with a lot of violence and extortion, but also by, providing some degree of support. So after that, the Taliban basically had to provide a lot of support to the local populations, and they needed to deploy fighters to that. They also lost some fighters in the floods that drowned or were injured during the conflict. They also had issues with moving the fighters around, with a lot of streets being flooded. And finally, they lost a lot of tax income because they tax the local economies quite violently, actually. But obviously, not to risk a major fallout with the local communities, you can't tax a farmer that just lost all of their harvest in flood. I mean, there's no point in that, and you lose whatever local support you have. But at the same time, the Pakistani military couldn't use that weakness because it had to coordinate and provide a nationwide relief to a major disaster, which required a lot of personnel and equipment. And also, if you see, actually, there's only a few major roads going north, and those are mostly in these red-shaped territory on the map, or red-colored territory, which is basically where you have all the floods being very intense. So if they didn't want to use basically day and night all of the helicopters to bring in troops, it would have been logistically impossible, to bring in a lot of soldiers to escalate fighting. So that we saw in the 6 to 12 months, like a more than 50% cut in fighting intensity. Unfortunately, the fighting intensity resumed, but there are other cases like the 2004 tsunami in Aceh, where actually this drop in fighting intensity was used for peace negotiations. All right, last slide, going a bit beyond the article. Gender matters. Gender really matters. I checked the sample, and one interesting finding that has now been published in an offshot paper is basically that rebel groups that have female members in both fighting and non-fighting roles. And if I say they have female members, means more than one or two. It's usually like at least 5% of the members are females. So those rebel groups are much more likely to escalate fighting after the disaster, and they are much less likely to de-escalate findings after disaster. So basically, rebel groups with a large or with a significant amount of female fighters obviously are more resilient, better able to cope with disasters, more likely to continue their core business, which is, fighting against the government. And why is that the case? And I'd say there are several reasons for that. So the first one is to provide relief to a disaster and to fight an insurgency, you need manpower or women power, if you want to say so. And if you have women, basically, if you recruit women into those roles, you by sheer mathematics have a 50% larger recruitment pool. So that helps. But women also offer some significant strategic advantages in post-disaster situations. We know that in a lot of conservative societies, women are much better able or are usually perceived as far less threatening. So if someone wants to build, if you, as a rebel group, you want to build connections to the local population, you usually send in the women because they are perceived as less threatening. And in post-disaster situation, rebels often depend on local communities for intelligence, for resources, to cooperate in the disaster relief. So that really pays off. Also, after disaster situations, usually the local situation changes quite a bit. You need intelligence, and usually women are less suspected by the security forces, at least in traditional societies, to be spies, to smuggle weapons, and so on. And again, coming to these two examples that I just discussed, Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, have a long history of having a reserve of female fighters that they can activate in terms when, for instance, when they have large losses from the government. And a lot of their male fighters are killed, they can quickly fill the ranks with female fighters. And that's what they did after the disasters. So they really relied on the female workforce, to say so. Taliban in Pakistan, for instance, have a very bad track record of including women. So when they needed to provide disaster relief, simultaneously fight the government, obtain new resources, build community relations, got more intelligence, they couldn't draw on this additional and quite specialized workforce of female members. So they were worse off. Yeah, that's basically the explanation behind that. If you're interested in more of this, so I think the presentation more or less is a summary of what I covered in the book. You can get a physical copy from MIT Press, but you can also download the virtual copy for free because it's open access. So if you don't want to spend $40 on buying the book, just download it for free. If you don't have time to read the entire book, obviously read the international security article, which I understand many of you did. Basically offshot study on the role of gender and women in this nexus has been published in Global Studies Quarterly just a few months back. And that's also, both of them are open access, so you can download them basically also free of charge if you don't have access via university library. All right, key takeaway points. So disaster conflict links are not deterministic. So disasters do not always lead to higher or lower conflict risks. And most importantly, they are multidirectional. So disasters can increase but also decrease conflict risks, which is something that we often forget when discussing climate change, disasters, and conflict. The strategy is basically the key mechanisms. So armed groups are mostly reacting to strategic opportunities or constraints to their fighting capacity and administrative capacity. But sometimes they try to convey a message to their audiences, for instance, by exercising restraint after a major disaster to allow humanitarian aid to come in. And to convey an image of themselves as, like responsible groups that are considering people's interest. Short-term power shifts are really important to understand why a conflict escalates or de-escalates after disasters. And that really goes because a lot of the literature so far has been focusing on structural factors, agricultural dependence, level of democracy, the levels of poverty. Those hardly change over time. But these really short-term shifts of power after disaster in the first weeks or months, they really go a long way in explaining what we can expect. And I argue that these findings are also relevant for other external shocks. So in the book, there's also a chapter on COVID-19 that finds remarkably similar patterns of rebel groups acting after COVID-19. But there's also evidence that the same applies, for instance, for international commodity price shocks, global economic crisis, or other forms of external shocks that have very similar impacts on the ground. And with that, I excuse again for being late. Thank you very much for joining and staying with me, and look forward to any questions if we have time.